Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third lecture of computer vision. Last week, we finished segmentation approaches and looked at k-means, which is a clustering algorithm, an algorithm from unsupervised learning. We saw that we can use that one for segmentation, for example, also to compress images. And we saw it overall works quite reasonable, provides okay results, far better than the random selection. And then we looked into feature detection and spent most of last week's lecture on feature detection. We discussed what a feature is. It's an interesting part of an image, and we're particularly interested in local features. We saw different types of features, like we looked at lines, we looked at corners and others. And for lines, we looked at ransack, which is a much more general algorithm, but we can use it to detect lines. We saw its pros and cons. One con is if there is too much noise, it doesn't work very well. And the Huff transform is specifically an algorithm that detects as lines in highly noisy images. We looked at the step-by-step procedure, how it works. And then we discussed in depth the Harris corner detector, which is one approach to find corners in images, which are very distinctive features. We set up this error equation and then step by step refined it. For that, we needed the Taylor expansion, which we also revised and applied this to the image intensity that is shifted. And eventually we could express this error calculation in a decomposition of a matrix and a vector. And then we looked into the matrix in order to determine its eigenvalues. We also briefly revised how that works. And then we completed the Harris corner detector and saw what the eigenvalues are useful for. Then we also looked into object recognition. First of all, we tried to distinguish some terms like classification, recognition, localization, detection, which are ambiguous, and others may define them differently, but this is how we're defining it in this lecture. And then we looked into object recognition and more approaches. We saw briefly template matching, we saw histograms, we saw they're easy to implement, probably also computationally cheap to run to a large extent, but they're not that powerful if you have a lot of variation in your images or if you cannot describe those objects very well. That's why those tasks are destined to be solved by learning. And if we use classic learning algorithms like SVMs, k-nearest neighbors, or others, we need to define features. But since there are so many feature detectors, it's awfully difficult to know which feature detector we should be using. And that's why today we're investigating neural networks, because neural networks, when they're deep, they have many hidden layers, and they allow us to self-learn features and then to learn the task. And that's the essence of today's lecture. We will be looking in particular in convolutional neural networks. But first, we start with a brief introduction to neural networks. And probably later today, we'll have a little bit of time to start with discussing image sequences and how to process image sequences. About the organization, I also sent you a message in iLearn. While the projects and your proposal presentations will be starting next month. So next month at some point, you will be presenting your project proposal, which is a 1 or 2 minute mini presentation, just what you want to investigate in your project. But this will be next month, and I'll inform you in advance when this will take place. But some of you may be interested in a robot vision project, which is, you can do any project related to computer vision, but some of you may want to do a robot vision project. And for those, there will be an opportunity to pick up your robot next week. I sent a message in iLearn. The lab assistant, Mr. Runkel, will be in the lab next week, in the deep learning lab next week, Thursday. and I sent you the dates when, or the time when he's available, as well as the room. Since you can pick the robot next week, the lecture will not take place next week. So we will do today's lecture, and then we will meet in 2 weeks again. And there's a limited number of robots, so make sure you go there quickly, and only take a robot if you're really interested in robots. So make sure that everyone can get a robot that wants to get one. Already look for potential team members. Ideally, there would be 1 robot per team, so everyone has a chance to get a robot. And I will teach the foundations of mobile robotics in a couple of weeks, and then you learn about the theory and the key essence of mobile robotics. But in advance, you can already become familiar with this NVIDIA chatbot platform. There are also other robots available in the lab. And then once you see the theory of mobile robotics, you can choose whether a mobile or whether a robot vision project is the right thing for you or not. If you take a look in our Nextcloud directory, where I'm storing the course materials, there's also a subfolder on the chatbot. There are some files in it. One of them is actually a video in which one of the students from 4 years ago presents how to use this chatbot platform. There's only a minor glitch in Nextcloud. This video somehow doesn't play as a video in Nextcloud. You only hear the audio, so you just download the file and you play the video locally, then it works. There's some strange issue with Nextcloud, but I have no control over Nextcloud and how to administer it. So just download that file, and it's a video and not just an audio. And there's some more supporting material in that Nextcloud directory from that student 4 years ago who wanted to make the chatbot platform more accessible to you, and that's why she created this video. And I think there are some slides and some additional material. Take a look at it in case you want a robot. For all robot-specific questions or purely about the hardware and how to get a robot, get in touch with Mr. Runkel. He's the manager of the Deep Learning Lab, and I'm the responsible person for the specific projects and the theory. But everything, if you come across some strange hardware issues, that the robot breaks, whatever, get in touch with Mr. Runkel. He'll be happy to help you with the hardware. So we'll now start with the chapter on convolutional neural networks. Convolutional neural networks are a type of neural networks that it has proven to be particularly useful to vision problems. Convolutional neural networks can be used for other kinds of data as well. And in order for us to understand convolutions, we first of all need to introduce neural networks. Depending on how far you are in your studies, you may have had some exposure to neural networks already or not. But we're starting from scratch, and we're discussing the essence of neural networks and how to train them. And then we'll look into deep neural networks and how to use them with convolutions. We have a deep learning course in our department, which is also mandatory in the AI undergrad programs. This deep learning course covers neural networks and deep learning in depth. But Professor Wahl does not address convolutional neural networks, since I discussed them here in depth in this course. But in order for us to understand the convolutional neural networks, we need to look a little bit into the foundations of essential neural networks and how to build them. Who of you has already worked with some neural networks? Maybe a thumbs up or thumbs down or green or red sticker, whatever, if you have already worked on neural networks so far, if you have ever built one or trained one. And maybe for those who have done this, let us know in the chat, or turn on your microphone and maybe tell us what you have used neural networks for. And as I said, you're most welcome to unmute your mic and tell us. If you're too shy or don't want to talk, feel free to send this to the chat. And once we have discussed convolutional neural networks, we'll look at a few more advanced topics, like how to optimize the hyperparameters of a neural network. We'll look at automated machine learning, how to train neural networks efficiently. and various selected architectures that may be helpful for you. In the last 1.5 years, the transformer approaches towards vision have become more popular, maybe the last 2 years or something. We'll be looking at so-called vision transformers in the Outlook chapter, because I think what the kind of neural networks that are still used the most in vision are convolutional neural networks. They have proven to be extremely helpful. Maybe over the coming years, there's a stronger shift towards vision transformers, but vision transformers, they come with new complexity and new challenges. They're not generally better than convolutional neural networks. I think the convolutional neural networks will still remain as probably the approach towards most vision problems. But in order to understand vision transformers, we need to understand how neural networks work, because transformer architectures are a type of neural network. That's something we're investigating in the Outlook chapter. Maybe in the next 2 years in this lecture, depending on how the market will develop, maybe this chapter 6 will more shift towards vision transformers. I'll just observe how the market is changing. But so far, whatever we want to do around neural networks for vision, be it convolutional neural networks, be it vision transformers, we need an intro to neural networks. And that's what we are starting now. So we actually want to build convolutional neural networks, and we have seen the concept of convolutions before already in this course, which we often call masks or kernels or filters. And essentially we said we have an image which has these pixels, and we have this kernel or mask or convolution, and we apply it to a certain area in the image. And one way how we can calculate the output is if we have this sub-image A, B, E, F, we apply this kernel to it. We multiply the elements with each other element-wise, so A times W, B times X, and so forth. And then we sum this together, and we have then one output pixel. Then we shift this kernel on B, C, F, G, and so forth. This is something you have seen already when we looked at filters in the first lecture. And this is actually a kind of approach we want to be applying to neural networks, because this kernel will be later a sort of feature detector for us. And we want to be able to learn such feature detectors and move them through the image and recognize features in images. The concept of convolutional neural networks can be applied to other data as well. For example, text data plus maybe in general data from natural language processing, also audio, but we'll be focusing on vision, and that's what the convolutional neural networks have also been applied to since the very beginning. Problems in NLP only came later. A neural network is an architecture that looks the following. We have so-called hidden units that are in between the input and output units. In the input units, we feed in our data. We have a certain number of units where we feed in. What we feed in can be text, it can be sensor data, or it can be images. And what we're feeding in are essentially just the pixels of an image. An image is 2D, but we will look at that later with convolutional neural networks. For now, we just assume we take our image and we just glue all those rows together so that we have one long row, essentially, or a vector of all the pixels. So we just break the 2D structure into a 1D structure, and we have all these pixels in one large array. And this is what we would be feeding in. So if we have a 50 times 50 pixel image, would be feeding in those pixel values, 2,500 many, into this neural network. And I just assume for now that we're using, again, grayscale images. If you use color images, you need the 3 channels. That's a little bit more work, but we'll also see that at the right moment in this course. So you feed in your inputs, and eventually you have some outputs, and you want to do something. You have k many outputs. You could use a neural network for classification. For example, you want to detect an object in an image, or you want to just classify the image into something, and we say there may be 10 different classes, and you would be feeding in your input, and you would be eventually generate an output. Later, we will see how to do this exactly. And then we would take the class for which the output has the greatest value, because for each output, we will get some value, and the output node that has the largest value, that would be the class. And then in between the inputs and outputs, we have a hidden layer or multiple hidden layers. And if we just have a few hidden layers, we call it a neural network. And if it has a lot of hidden layers, we call this a deep neural network, because it is deep, because it has many layers. Those neural networks, they are loosely inspired by how the human brain works. It's very important. This is not how the human brain works. Maybe it's very loosely inspired. And the structure looks the following. We have the input units, and each input unit is connected to every unit in the subsequent layer. So every unit from the input layer is connected to every unit in the first hidden layer. Then if we have a second hidden layer, all units of the first hidden layer are connected to the units of the second layer, and so forth. And then we take the last hidden layer, and each unit in the last hidden layer is connected to every unit in the output layer. And those connections, they are called weights or parameters, and they are a numeric value. And when we train the neural network on our training data, we want to determine the weight values in a way so that this neural network can learn the pattern of our training data well. And later, once we have done the training, we can feed in new inputs and we can try to classify them. Rather than classifying, you could also be using a neural network for regression. You can be using neural networks also in an unsupervised way. You can use neural networks and combine them with reinforcement learning. There are all sorts of variations. In this course, we mainly care about supervised learning and how to use them for classification or regression. And those neural networks, as I said, they're loosely inspired by how the human brain works. They are extremely helpful because they allow us to learn very complex nonlinear hypotheses. In particular, we can also learn features on our own when those neural networks are deep, but this is something we'll be seeing later. And so far, neural networks in the past were largely used for discriminative tasks like classification and regression. But in recent years, neural networks have become extremely helpful for generative tasks. Generative tasks you have seen all over, for example, around ChatGPT. ChatGPT is also a kind of neural network eventually. You can also use neural networks to generate images and so forth. So this is what neural networks are so helpful for. And while neural networks have appeared in the last few years in a lot of applications, they're actually nothing new. Neural networks started already to appear in the 1950s. There are even some earlier works, probably from the 1940s, that we would count towards this field of neural networks nowadays. And they were one part that was or one area in machine learning, or say in AI in general, that is often also referred to as so-called connectionism, because you connect all these units. And the inspiration is that these units are neurons, and our human brain is a neural network which connects neurons, and this is mimicked by this architecture. However, these neurons, they are just mathematical units, and this is far simpler than how the human brain works, both in terms of the dynamics as well as the topology. So I see a lot of startups, they are now selling deep learning solutions, and they claim they are building something that works like the human brain. Don't fall for that. That's not the case. Neural networks, sometimes we also call them artificial neural networks, are far simpler than the human brain, and they also serve, I think, a totally different purpose. But this was already investigated from the 1950s to 70s, maybe some works even from the 40s. Initial works were on so-called perceptrons. So I'm sending the term here in the chat. A perceptron is a very, very simple architecture where you have your inputs, and for each input you have a weight, and then you calculate a function and you generate an output. It's something that looks a little bit like logistic regression. So logistic regression is a simple, or not simple, but a machine learning model often used for a linear classification. And these perceptrons, they are a little bit simpler than logistic regression because they don't have an error function that is differentiable. Rather, training a perceptron is a relatively simple way that comes with lots of unexpected outputs, but this is what was often worked on. And in the past, there was often also something referred to as MLPs, so-called multi-layer perceptrons, when you put these perceptrons into multiple layers and you connect them in an architecture like here or before. So this is something that was often called a multi-layer perceptron. However, what we use nowadays in neural networks, they're not really perceptrons, they are logistic regression units, and they have an error function that is differentiable. But so if you hear MLP, essentially this just refers to multi-layer perceptrons, which are neural networks. And in the 70s and 80s, people started to glue these perceptrons together. Perceptrons are simple because they are just linear classifiers. So in the early days, there was a book on perceptrons, and this one argued that perceptrons are only linear classifiers, they weren't that powerful, and then the impression was created, or it was largely understood that way, that perceptrons as such were not useful. However, if you combine them into networks, they tend to be quite powerful. And that's what we are doing nowadays with neural networks, where we glue together logistic regression units. In the 1980s, there was a peak for this, and things like handwriting recognition, autonomous driving, this was already achieved in the 1980s and 1990s with neural networks. And convolutional neural networks were also already popular in that time. However, there was a big drop of popularity after this first peak because there were a lot of expectations that could not be fulfilled. And in the 1980s, 1990s, computational resources were expensive. There was a lack of training data. And if you don't have enough training data, neural networks tend to overfit because they easily have a lot of parameters. We can look at that here. Imagine you have a hidden layer with 1,000 units and another hidden layer with another 1,000 units. You already have 1 million connections because you connect every unit to every unit in the next layer. So neural networks, with neural networks, you easily have millions of parameters or hundreds of millions if you build them sufficiently large. And you need enough data in order to reduce or avoid overfitting. And that was something which wasn't that available in the 80s and 90s, plus computing time was expensive. And then in 2006, there was actually a breakthrough paper. And in 2006, Mr. Hinton, who's one of the pioneers in neural networks, he described a new approach of training neural networks with less data. So it was a new approach how to train neural networks and make them work with a lot of hidden layers. Plus more data was available, computing time was cheaper, and this has led to this deep learning popularity in the last 18 years now. This figure here was from a few years ago, so there was this hype curve and a question where all of this would go. I think neural networks have become far more popular since 2014, and we're using them now in a lot of applications. And you also have lots of neural networks in your phone nowadays, for example, for speech recognition and all sorts of other tasks. Neural networks, they are not a silver bullet. They come with new challenges, and neural networks are not generally better than other machine learning approaches. However, for certain problems like in vision or speech or natural language processing in general, neural networks are quite helpful for a lot of these tasks. And this is a little bit about the history of neural networks. What happened here in the 1980s and 90s after this huge rise of popularity, there was a drop. This is sometimes also often referred to as the so-called second AI winter. There was an AI winter before, and this was the second one. AI winter means a lot of expectations, a lot of funding, also in research, but then a lot of these expectations could not be fulfilled, and there was a drop in popularity. But now we're certainly in a new peak, but we also have reached a good plateau because neural networks will not suddenly disappear again. Maybe their capabilities are sometimes a bit exaggerated, but they are definitely now deployed to a very large scale in a lot of applications. And this is something that was not the case in the 1980s and 1990s. So I will now tell you a little bit about how neural networks work and how they propagate inputs. And for this, I will switch to my whitepad on the iPad and show you how that works. We'll now look at neural networks. In particular, we will look at a so-called forward propagation. And we have our neural network, which has its input units. So we call this, say, x1 up to xd, and d many inputs. And then we have, so I'll also write this here. I'm trying to recreate the plot or the figure from the slides a little bit. However, this may vary a little bit. So this is the input layer, and then we have the hidden layer, and we have an output layer. And the output layer, we said we have k many outputs. So we have y1 up to yk. And then we have this hidden layer in between, where we have, we call this Z1 up to Zm. And then the connectivity is, again, every unit in the input layer is connected to every unit in the output layer. And we just have one hidden layer for now. So every input unit is connected to every unit in the hidden layer, and every unit in the hidden layer is connected to every unit in the output layer. Something like this. And imagine there are much more units, not just two. And what we want to do is we assume now that these neural networks, or that this neural network is already trained, so that these weights are already there. So this is our weight from D to M. And this is the first layer. This is a notation that is sometimes used in the book. But if you look out throughout the books, there are various different notations. So I don't care too much about the exact notation, how we call these weights now. It's the weight that connects the one unit to the other. Well, this one here we would call, for example, so we said from D to M. So this would be from 1 to M, for example, that weight. And this weight here would be from 1 to 1, just in order to give them a few names. And now we want to do a so-called forward propagation. And the forward propagation is it's already trained, and we put in an input, and we want to calculate the output. And what we are doing is we take the first unit and its corresponding weight to the next unit, and we multiply them. So we multiply the value that is in x1, and we multiply this with that weight from x1 to z1. Then we have a second unit here, which we call x2, and x2 is also connected to z1. So we would say we then take our x2 and we multiply it with the weight from x1, from x2 to z1. So this would be something like this, and so forth. So we calculate a sum of products. We do this for up to our xd times the corresponding weight. And the weight is something we would call weight 1d. And there was a minor mistake, just one, because it's all in the first layer. So we are calculating a sum of products, writing this here, a sum of products. And we're doing something now with this sum of products. We will not store the sum of products directly in set 1. For example, we could do that, but it could happen that this value gets extremely large in its absolute value, either positive or negative, because x1, x2 may be large values, the weights could be large. Ideally, we want the weights to be small, but all of this could just get out of control and we don't know where it's going. So we want to put this sum of products into a so-called activation function. And an activation function, for which we have many, we would use, for example, one that is the most simple one, or not the most simple one, but say the most common one that was used for a long time and is still used for certain cases today. It's called the sigmoid function, for which we just use a sigma x, and we have 1 and divide 1, we divide this by 1 plus e to the minus x. Who of you has ever seen such a function before? Maybe thumbs up, thumbs down. Also, if you have not done neural networks, you may have seen this. Maybe send us in the chat where you have seen this function. If you have seen them around neural networks, just let us know. If you have seen this in some other context, also let us know in the chat, because this function is only used as a helper for neural networks. It's not constrained to neural networks. And we will try to plot this sigmoid function now. And the sigmoid function, we have our x and our y. So all of you who have responded have seen this in the context of neural networks. That's okay. There's also a different context where you may have seen this. And this sigmoid function, we will try to plot now. For x equals 0, it is 0.5. For negative x's, it goes towards 0, and for large x's, it goes towards 1. So this is the sigmoid function, converges to 1 for large x values. For large negative x values, it converges towards 0. This is the sigmoid function, and what it leads to is, if you use this as a so-called activation function for our nodes, then the node value will be constrained between 0 and 1. So even if your inputs or weights are very large, it will either converge towards 1 or converge towards 0 or be somewhere around 0.5 for smaller values. And like this, you just constrain that this value doesn't get out of control and which could influence your whole prediction. There are other activation functions, and we will see them later in the context of deep learning, but this is just now in classic neural networks, a function that was used for a long time. Later, when we look at deep learning, you'll see more activation functions. And in this forward propagation, so now we have calculated the value of Z1. Remember, we calculate the sum of products. And then after we have done this, we put the sum of products into the activation function, and the value that comes out of the activation function will go into our Z1. Then we are doing exactly the same for Z2, that we are calculating the sum of products based of all the connections that go in Z2. We just use the same values x1 through xd, but we have new weights that actually connect to here. So we take these corresponding weights. We have a sum of products. We put this then into the activation function. We have a value in Z2, and we are doing this for up to Zm, where we again have maybe a lot of elements in the hidden layer. And then we have calculated this, and there's a question why it's desired that this doesn't get out of control. We want to avoid extreme values in these nodes, because what can often lead to, if maybe one node gets value is much bigger than the others, the whole prediction could be severely influenced, or also when training, we may just learn a very inaccurate pattern. But we'll see this later, because there are also other activation functions that for which we could get substantially larger values, but we'll see that later, and then I can address the question better. And once we have done this for the hidden layer, we could be continuing this for the next hidden layer. So we would continue a forward propagation to every unit in the second hidden layer and so forth up to the output layer. And then we have values in the output units. And if we want a classification, we would take the class for which the unit has the largest value, because this is the most probable class the input data is in. For example, in Y2, we would have the largest value, and this class would stand for something. Maybe there's a car in for which label Y1 stands, a cat for Y2, and YK for a house. There could be many, many other labels in there. And if we put in an image, so our pixel values in a grayscale image, we do the forward propagation, we get the output, and then we take the class with the largest value. That would be for the classification. You can also use this for regression. And if you do regression, you would not use the sigmoid function in the last layer. So in the last layer, you would be just calculating the sum of products. And if you do that, then you have a regression value. But for all the other layers, the hidden layers, you would still be using the activation function. If you take a look at the slides, what is written there is slightly more complex, because there are more units in there. Concretely, you see such units that they call X0 or Z0, and they are also connected to here. This is just another weight. In fact, this is just a bias weight, which means this is the y-intercept that you would just add on top in here. So you would just add this on top. This is the y-intercept, which you know from linear regression, for example. This is the idea of a forward propagation. And what we already assume we have in the forward propagation are the weight values. And the weight values, they have to be learned. And we will now discuss how we can actually train a neural network. So how do we find the weights in this neural network so that it actually learns the pattern well? Because for forward propagation, We just predict, we are done. And for training a neural network, we need so-called loss functions, sometimes also called error functions. And I'll show you now the notation that I personally use here. If you talk to someone else or look into different literature, there may be slightly different notation. So we have this cost function, loss function, whatever you name it. Sometimes it's called Che in the literature. Sometimes it's an E for error, but this doesn't matter. And we will use a weight vector. If you take a look into the slides, rather than this weight vector, I use a theta. Sometimes theta is also used to refer to the set of parameters, but that doesn't matter for now, whether we call it weights or theta. It's just the set of parameters. And what we want is an error function or cost function that determines us how bad our model is right now. So we have a training set, or maybe not a training set yet, say a test set. And we want to apply this test set to our neural network. For each example, we predict, and we know its correct label. And then we sort of want to calculate the difference between the true label from our data and the label we have actually predicted. And if there's some error, we want to add this up. And what we do is we have many training examples. So in my notation, I always use an M for the number of training examples and an N for the number of features. If you look into the literature, sometimes different notation is used for that. And I have my label. So my index is I for the examples. I have my label in my test set. And I have my neural network that predicts, where I'm not using the theta. So I use the W for the weights. And I put in an input example. And X, you will see in the slides, is a vector, because X is one input vector, can be an image, can be something else. And since it's more than just one element in it, it's a vector. And with index I, we put this in a neural network. So this is the neural network. And we predict the label. We have the correct label in our data set. And if there is a difference, so we take the one minus the other, if there's a difference, this difference could be positive or negative, but we just want to sum together these differences. So we square the difference. So this difference will then be always 0 or positive. And with squaring, we also make sure that small differences count very little and big differences count even more. And then we sum together these errors. And what we often do is we divide this sum by m, because m is the number of examples. And we just want to normalize this and divide by m. Otherwise, this sum just gets too big and it's hard to store or process. And we just divide by m. And this is the squared error function. Which you also see in many other machine learning models. And the squared error function is often used for regression problems. It can also be used for classification problems, but there are other error functions that you can use. And I'll show you this in my slide deck. Only difference here in the slide deck is in my slides, I use a theta for the weight vector. On the iPad, I've used a W, which is just the weight vector. And it would mean just all the weights are in that vector from all the different layers. And I can use this squared error function also for classification problems. However, if you have classification problems, sometimes you don't want to be using the squared error terms for classification problems. there's a different error function that is called the cross entropy, which is more suitable for classification problems. But you can also use for now just this squared error function. The difference doesn't matter too much for us. It's something that would be discussed in detail in a machine learning course, but we assume that here in our computer vision course. All we want is an error function or cost function. And our goal is now that we sort of fit the weights so that that error goes down, because we have a training set for which we want to train the machine learning model. And we want to then update the weights so that eventually we have a good set of weights for which that error is low on the training set. And then we would test it with the test set and also hope that it's low or not. But then there are certain adjustments we can make. What's also in the slides, what I have skipped, is just here a more formal definition of the sum of weights and our sigmoid function. But I have drawn this on the iPad. And now we want to know, how can we optimize those weights? Because I said we have a certain error on our training set, and we want to change the weights so we can eventually have better weights, learn the pattern better, and make better predictions. And for this, I will also switch back to the iPad, and we will be using an approach that we call gradient descent. Maybe sort of the simplest way how to update the weights and try to improve them is we just use random values in the weights in our model. And if there's a high error, maybe we just randomly assign the weights again and hope we get better, but that's probably not too great. So we need a more structured approach. And we will use now an approach that is called gradient descent. It's a numerical optimization technique that is used for a lot of machine learning models, not just neural networks. And what I have is the following. Who of you has already come across gradient descent in the past? Maybe let me know with a reaction, positive or negative, if that's something you had seen. But we also have students from all sorts of degree programs in here, not just AI. So there are also some who have not seen it. And I will explain you how I interpret all of this. So if you have learned this already in a different course, but you get my view on this, maybe it may help just to get a slightly different explanation. What I have is an error function, and we will slightly simplify this now. We will assume that W is not a weight vector, but just a single weight for now. We will later look at a weight vector, but now we assume our machine learning model only has one weight, only one parameter, and I want to optimize it. So I have a smaller error. And later we'll look at how this works if we have multiple parameters. We will start with some initial weight, which I call maybe weight star. And I'm starting with some weight, could be 0, could be some random value. And then I can calculate my error. We've just seen how I can calculate the error, and I will have some error. And my goal is I want to change the weight so the error goes down. And we have a very simple error function for now. We only have one minimum in here. And what I can do is then I see, well, my error is like this. And I need to now go into the direction or change the weight so that the error goes down. If you're, or what you remember from high school and an introduction to calculus, if you just have a single parameter in a function and you want to find its minimum, you would just take the derivative of the function and check where the function is 0, and you would analytically solve this optimization problem. So you would just find the minimum, which is straightforward for a single parameter. But if you have a function of 2 variables, you need to do quite more effort to find the minimum. But later, we will think about neural networks or models that have millions or billions of parameters. And I told you before, when we have our hidden layer, and we maybe have 1,000 units in there, and then 1,000 units in the next hidden layer, we already have 1 million connections. So 1 million weights. So an analytical approach to solving this optimization problem doesn't really work, because modern neural networks, they have billions of parameters, and the only reasonable way to solve this is some numerical approach. And gradient descent is a simple yet effective numerical approach to solving such problems. So I don't want to solve this analytically, as you would learn in an introduction to calculus or in high school, rather numerically. And what I'm doing is now, I can wonder about the slope. So I have this initial error, and then I have a slope here, or a tangent, and I want to go into the direction where this error goes down. So that means I want to go down here. I will do one step, and then I will measure the error again, which would be for here. So weight 1 now. Then I would go again in further down this function, where I have now weight 2. And 1 and 2 here, they don't mean different weights, just new weight values. And I would do this until I am close to the minimum and I converge. And this approach is called gradient descent. So I would take some initial weight value, I would determine the error or cost, and then try to update the weight and slowly go towards a minimum and then converge. Why is this called gradient descent and not just slope descent or whatever? We will slowly write down some equations how this works, and then see that it actually makes sense to call this gradient descent. So in the simplest form now, we would do something like loop until convergence. So we would keep doing the following steps until the weight update is done. I say weight, and I update the weight. So I take its current value, and I'm subtracting its derivative. Because what I have done up here is I have put in this tangent, and what I can also, in order to calculate the tangent in that point, I need the derivative. And the derivative here is positive, because the derivative goes up here. So I want to go in the opposite direction of the derivative in order to go down. So I say the weight value gets updated to its weight value minus the derivative. So the derivative of J, this one here is just a derivative. You could also just write this out as, for example, J prime, which is just a derivative of the cost function or this error function. But I already write down, just to emphasize, the derivative is along this one weight. Now I have done this, and I keep running this loop until it converges. So I'm going down step by step, and then these errors get smaller until I stop. This is one way how you can write it. Something you would also be often putting in front is an alpha, and this alpha is the learning rate. And the learning rate is some numerical value that you would put in. It's often a small numerical value, 0.1, 0.03, whatever, in order to reduce the impact of this derivative. Because what can happen in if this function looks a little bit different, what can happen is that you're not going down here step by step, but rather you could be oscillating. Something like this could be happening. And then you're not optimizing, but rather, or you're not converging, rather you're diverging. And in order to avoid such oscillation when optimizing the error function, you would be putting such a learning rate, and you would determine it through experiments in order to find a good setting. This is a so-called hyperparameter, because so it's called hyperparameter because you have parameters in a model, like your weights. For now, we only had one weight. Soon we will have many weights. These are the parameters of your model, and some global model parameter is called a hyperparameter, like this learning rate. There's a question that I got in private about when this error function becomes more complex and it's not just a local minimum. We'll be seeing that later. I definitely have this in mind, but it would just take a little bit for me to get there. Because what we have seen is we only have one parameter in the model, but actually our model has many parameters. And for this, we need to update this loop here a little bit. And so I write here for one parameter. And now we will do this loop for many parameters. Again, loop until convergence. And now we have multiple weights. So we have weight 1 where we are doing this. Weight 1 minus alpha times. And what I said before, don't confuse this with these weight 1, weight 2, because this was rather just like a time step where I said this was the first time step, then the next time step, and so forth until it converges. But now we have multiple parameters, multiple weights, and I have my error function, but if I have multiple parameters, I cannot just write d of something. Rather, I'm using partial derivatives, and I'm taking the partial derivative along weight 1. Then I'm doing this for multiple parameters. I'm doing this for the next parameter, because for me, it's a little bit difficult to plot this now with multiple parameters. So we started with one parameter, and we say, well, this is the next parameter minus alpha times the partial derivative of j along weight 2. And I'm doing this, say, up to, I say I have k many parameters in this model. So up to something like this. And in the slides, it's all plotted or written, formatted very nicely. This is what I'm doing here in my gradient descent. And why is this called gradient descent? Because I haven't used the term gradient at all yet. Who of you knows what a gradient is? If you remember the word gradient, maybe thumbs up. And if someone remembers it, quickly send it to the chat what the gradient of a function actually is. Someone says a slope. Yes, but maybe a bit more concretely, especially with regards to a function that has multiple parameters. The rate of change, yes, but not just for a single parameter. So gradient example, we will quickly look at it. Since the answers in the chat are not exactly what I want. So I have a function, say it's f of x1 x2, and it's something like x1 squared plus 2x2. I want to know from you, what's the partial derivative of x along, what's the partial derivative of f along x1? And what's the partial derivative of f along x2? If you know what's the first partial derivative, let us know. Remember, we have now two variables, x1 and x2, and when you differentiate along one variable, the other variables are considered constant. So for the first one, this would be the constant, and we would just be doing the partial or the derivative on that part. So this would be 2 times x1, and the other one where we care about x2, x1 would be the constant. So this would just be 2, which matters, and the other one is the constant. So these are the partial derivatives, and the gradient of f, and this is maybe the thing to do in blue, the gradient of f, we write as nabla of f, is a vector of all the partial derivatives. Who of you remembers this now that I quickly revised it? The gradient is the vector of partial derivatives. If you remember this, maybe thumbs up. And this would be 2x1 and 2. So the vector of partial derivatives. And here we will now come to our gradient descent, because, and something I forgot before to say is that all these in this loop are done in parallel. So we calculate for weight 1, weight 2, up to weight k. Obviously, we're maybe not fully able to do this like through parallel threads, whatever. But what I mean in parallel is if I update weight 2, in order to calculate this part here, I would be using weight 1 from the previous iteration. So when I update weight 1 in this loop, I will in the next lines always use the old weight 1, and I will always use or when I update a weight, I'm not using that updated weight in the next command, rather in the next iteration. That's what I mean with that this runs in parallel. And this one here, we have written out, we update weight 1, we update weight 2, weight k. We can rewrite this where we say that the weight is now a vector, and we update that weight vector by subtracting alpha, the learning rate, times nabla f, which is the gradient. So this one here is the gradient. And what I have here is just a vectorized description, because my weight vector is all these weights I have there. I take that vector, and from each element in the weight vector, I'm subtracting the corresponding element in the gradient, and I always multiply this with alpha. That's why this is called gradient descent. If I express this, these statements in the loop just in terms of a vector and the gradient. That's why it's gradient descent and not slope descent, whatever. So we have slowly developed now our gradient descent. We got a few questions here in the chat. What happens if this error function is more complex? This error function here, or cost function, was the one in blue, so I'm just marking that we know this. This one here is convex. Convex means we have exactly one minimum. So our local minimum is our global minimum. And we can also have a non-convex cost function. And this could look something like as I'll visualize now. A non-convex one could look something like this. And here, obviously, the risk is that I could get stuck in a local minimum and I don't make it to this global minimum. So this is local, but we actually care about the global one. These are some optimization challenges we will discuss later in the course. With the model we have so far, there's a risk we get stuck in a local one. But whatever optimization technique you use that is common for neural networks, you always have some risk of getting stuck in a local one, and you not necessarily make it to the global one, because these cost functions become highly non-convex when you have a lot of parameters. So this is something that you cannot fully avoid. However, there are certain tricks trying to get an okay local minimum, but that's something we'll be seeing later. But now we know why this whole algorithm is called gradient descent, because we think in terms of the weight vector or weight vector, and in terms of the gradient, and not in terms of individual partial derivatives. This plot is just what I had shown in essence, and this gradient descent that I had shown you is also written down here in a nice way. We just use a theta instead of a W for weight, but we repeat this until convergence. We have our partial derivatives that we take, and we update our weights. And I had shown you also on the whiteboard how to do this with a weight vector and how to use the gradient. This algorithm is sometimes also called the batch gradient descent, because batch means we calculate this cost or error for all the examples. And we may have a lot of examples in M, because we may have millions of training examples. So there's also a more common variation of this, which is called stochastic gradient descent, because one issue with gradient descent is that calculating this here could take extremely long if we have a lot of training examples. But we're just slowly updating the weights. And with stochastic gradient descent, we just look at one example for one example, or maybe not one, sometimes a few examples. We calculate that error and update the weight. Maybe this doesn't help us to always immediately go towards the global minimum or local minimum. Rather, we are wandering around the minimum, but with this so-called stochastic gradient descent, where we calculate this error for a single example or a few examples, we just make progress in the optimization much quicker. This is something that would be discussed in detail in a machine learning course, but since you have a machine learning course in parallel, I'm not explaining stochastic gradient descent in detail. You should rather just know it's a very efficient variation of gradient descent that will help us to make progress in the optimization much quicker, because I'm unable to discuss all the details of a machine learning course here, because it's a computer vision course, and we rather want to use the essentials to take to calculate or to train neural networks for vision. But these approaches here, gradient descent, stochastic gradient descent, they're common in machine learning, and they're used for other models than just neural networks. One big question that is left is, how can I actually calculate these partial derivatives efficiently? Because this cost function may be a relatively complex function with a lot of parameters. How can I calculate this in detail? One algorithm that is used in detail for this or efficiently is called backpropagation. And the idea of backpropagation is you're starting with some initial weights. I'll show you this in terms of this figure. You're starting with some initial weights, and you're doing a forward propagation for your examples. then you have some error in the outputs, and then you're back propagating that error, and you're trying to figure out how much each parameter contributes to the error. And that's why it's called back propagation. But back propagation is also explained in detail by Professor Wahl in his deep learning course. All we need to know in a computer vision course is that back propagation is an efficient algorithm that finds us our partial derivatives that we can then use in gradient descent. And one thing left for backpropagation, I said we're using some initial weights. In a lot of machine learning models, initial weights that you use are just zeros. This does not work with backpropagation because backpropagation would learn some symmetries and you wouldn't be able to learn the pattern well. So what you're typically doing in backpropagation is that you're randomly initializing the weights with very small values epsilon around positive or negative. And you would initialize each weight with a random value from that distribution or just from a uniform distribution, for example, and you would just pick a small epsilon for this. And once you have randomly initialized those weights, backpropagation works well. But this is something, again, that is discussed by my colleague in the deep learning class. And now we have seen essentially all the foundations of very simple neural networks. And we will now wonder how we can use this in order to build deep learning models, especially those for vision. This plot here summarizes quite well what we want to do. We will now not use just neural networks that have a single hidden layer or two hidden layers, but many. What they can do efficiently is the following. In last week's lecture, we saw that we can use machine learning on features in order to learn tasks, for example, object recognition. But we don't know which features we should actually, which ones we should calculate beforehand. There are lots of different feature detectors, lots of different features. That's where deep learning comes into play, because in a deep neural network, yes, we have our input layer, we have our output layer, but in between, we have many hidden layers. And when we have many hidden layers, we are first of all adding complexity to this model because we are adding lots of parameters. And more parameters means more training time, more data needed, more risk of overfitting. However, if we have enough data and the right algorithms and enough computing resources, we can still train this deep neural network. And then you can try in vision, you can try to visualize what each node actually learns. And it was then noticed already in the 80s and 90s that if you have such a deep neural network, the first few layers, they would learn to recognize very simple features. For example, the first few hidden layers, they would learn to recognize edges, for example. Not because you have put in a feature detector, but rather this was learned and was noticed to be an initial feature, and it was learned purely from the data, while later features are more complex features that were self-learned. For example, groups of edges. For example, faces of cats and humans. And then later layers, they could even learn groups of groups. For example, a human representation, a cat representation. This is something that was a little bit understood in the 80s and 90s, but couldn't be done at scale because there was not enough data and not enough computing resources and not the right algorithms. But this is something that has been done in this deep learning domain for the last 15 to 18 years now, that you don't describe features for vision tasks. Rather, you put in the raw images in the deep neural network, and the first few layers learn to recognize simple features, later layers more complex features, and so forth. And the last few layers, they do the actual learning of your task. And so what you're learning in a neural network in vision is a set or a hierarchy of increasingly more complex features. For vision, you can easily visualize it, but exactly the same is done for natural language processing or speech or whatever. You learn a hierarchy of increasingly more complex features. And this has led to numerous extremely well-known machine learning applications, especially in vision and natural language processing, because you don't need to describe features anymore. Rather, you learn them, and then based on these features, you learn your tasks. Neural networks comes with challenges because when you try to train such a deep neural network, you need to ask yourself, how many layers do I want? How many units per layer? That's something, honestly, we don't know. If I want more layers, I could learn a better feature hierarchy, but it could lead to more overfitting. If I put more units in a layer, probably more feature detectors, but again, more overfitting, more training time. How many training examples do I need? We don't know. Sometimes we hope the more the better, but we also need to add representative examples. And when I build a very large neural network, obviously I may need a lot of training time. So I need some way to speed this up. Better algorithms, better hardware, and so forth. So just adding more layers comes with new challenges, but we can self-learn features. And this is something we'll be investigating. I also said before, there are more activation functions. The sigmoid function is one that has been used for decades. This is exactly the function we had seen before, converges to 1 for very large positive values, converges to 0 for very large negative values, and for 0.5, for input 0, the output value is 0.5. And this one was used for many, many decades, and it wasn't questioned much if this was the right approach. And then maybe some 10 years ago or something, someone proposed to use a much simpler activation function, which is called ReLU, which is the rectified linear unit function. And it's 0 for input 0 or negative. And for positive values, we just map the input value to the output value. So it's just a linear function here, but 0 for all the other inputs. And this ReLU function is much faster to compute because you don't need the exponential function as you need it in a sigmoid function. And there are also all sorts of interpretations if this was actually closer to how humans learn and what kind of benefits it could bring. This, again, is probably discussed in detail in a deep learning course, but nowadays, a lot of people use this ReLU function or some variation of the ReLU function for all the hidden units in a neural network, because you can compute it much faster, and it's also been demonstrated that this severely reduces overfitting compared to the sigmoid function, because for negative inputs and input 0, it's just 0, so you're effectively reducing the number of parameters in a model when an input is 0 and then all the parameters depend or that are connected or multiplied with that 0, that product would also be 0. So it's some sort of regularizer that actually reduces overfitting, and it's much faster to compute. And that's why the ReLU function or some variation has become very popular. The sigmoid function is something you may still be using, for example, in the outputs in order to determine which class you would pick. For some kind of neural networks, the sigmoid function is probably still used. Plus, there are other activation functions. In the literature, you find dozens of activation functions, not just ReLU and sigmoid, but I just wanted to contrast these two. And when you build a neural network nowadays, by default, you would often just use this ReLU function or some variation. There were a few questions before that I want to address. One was the local and global minimum, how to avoid this. We'll be seeing this later. There was another question that I quickly want to go back on the iPad, and then this will also be more clear. One question was that I said in here, when you update weight 2, you would be using the old weight 1 and not the one from the current iteration, because that's exactly what you're doing when you have this written in such a vectorized way, because when you update the second row in your vector, you're using then if you use values from the first row, you would be not using the updated one, but the past one, because all of this is done in parallel. And that's why when you implement this, make sure when you update, say, weight 2 by calculating this partial derivative, use the weight 1 from the past iteration and don't just update weight 1 first and then use the new weight 1 in here. Because this is all supposed to be done in parallel or independently and not sequentially dependent on each other. And that's exactly how you do it when you have this vectorized notation. Now we can apply all of this to vision. In computer vision, we have lots of challenges when it comes to our image data. We have seen before that we may have, or in the past classes, we could have various noise, for example, translation, that in our training images or in our images in general, we not always have the objects in the same positions. It could be somewhere shifted. That's what we call translation. But the objects could also be rotated a little bit. And we also want to address that. So we actually want to build neural networks that are invariant, so they can handle some level of translations and a little bit of rotations. And for this, we will have an architecture that we call a convolutional neural network. A convolutional neural network works quite different to the standard regular neural networks we had seen, because if I just go back to our first neural network we saw today, we saw we have a vector of inputs. And if we use this for image data, we would just break up our 2D image and we turn it into one vector. And then we put in a vector to learn something or to classify something. Overall, we're losing a lot of information if we turn a 2D image into a 1D vector. So a convolutional neural network actually allows us to work on 2D data. So in a neural network, we have so-called convolutional layers, and there are convolutions, which are features that we learn. And in this convolutional layer, those convolutions, they look at a 2D section of the input image. And this is visualized here by this blue one. So we have our feature detector, which looks at a certain input part of the image. And we have multiple of these feature detectors in our convolutional layer. For example, we also have this red one. And as you can see, these windows that they are looking at, they are slightly overlapping. And with this, we can address that we want to be invariant to some level of translations and rotations. There are more reasons how we become invariant, but they should partially overlap. And then we will discuss today in detail how to build such a convolutional layer. And furthermore, we also have a subsampling layer. And the subsampling layer, again, has features which are from a certain, or which look at a certain window in the convolutional layer. And in the subsampling layer, we're trying to compress that information by doing certain summary statistics like maximum, minimums, averages. But that's something we'll be seeing later. First of all, we'll be looking at convolutions. And in a convolutional neural network, you would have a convolutional layer, then a subsampling layer, at least in the simplest form. But you could have this followed by another convolutional layer, another subsampling layer, or you leave out the subsampling layer and you just have a few convolutional layers behind. And when you build such an architecture, you're self-learning features. So this has nothing to do with the actual classification yet. Rather, we are building feature, or we are learning features from the data. And for vision, this would be the first few layers would be edges, corners, and this kind of stuff. And later layers would be groups of edges, as we have seen in this deep learning figure from before. Now, after a break, we'll continue. This concept of convolutions or masks or filters is something we have seen a lot in this course now. This is just a different visualization of this concept from that we will also be seeing more often now, but you've seen this before. This is the kernel or the mask or the filter or the convolution. We apply it to a certain part of the input. We calculate a value by multiplying one element by the one in the kernel and the next one and so forth, and sum these products together, and then we would have calculated this 19. We shift the kernel around and we calculate this output. And this is a kind of concept we'll be using now in a lot in convolutional neural networks. Concretely, convolutional neural networks, they come with various properties, and we will specifically discuss so-called sparse interactions, spatial agreement, and parameter sharing. The equivariant representations are more like a consequence of all of this. And we'll be looking at our sparse interactions. And there's sometimes a lot of text here in the slides, but the text is often just for you to have a proper revision if you want to do these readings. But we'll not read out all this text in here. We will look at this figure and we'll look at this lower part. What we see is we have our input pixels in an image, x1, x2, x3, x4, and x5. And we know from traditional neural networks that each pixel in the input image would be connected, because that would be every node in the input layer would be connected to every node in the first hidden layer. So x1 through x5 are input pixels, and s1 through s5 are nodes in the first hidden layer, and they would be all connected with each other. As a consequence, this leads to a lot of parameters. Now, the convolutional neural networks, they will look in 2D on those images, but what they do is that not every unit in the first hidden layer is connected to every unit in from the inputs. Rather, you have a pixel, say x3, and only some of the units in the first hidden layer look at that. So x3 would be looked at by units s2, s3, s4. How wide this would be is something you can configure. So this would be the kernel width. x4 would be looked at by s3, s4, and s5. And that's exactly what we saw here before, that you don't look from in every unit in the convolutional layer at every unit in the inputs. Rather, you would only have this window. And this leads to, first of all, to much less parameters, which makes the model far more trainable. You're wondering, how can this neural network look at all the pixels then? Well, you have multiple of these feature detectors that you're training in a convolutional neural network. And the next one would be looking at a different window. And ideally, these windows overlap a little bit, but not every input is connected to every unit in the convolutional layer. So you're reducing the number of parameters. And the same would be valid if you add a second layer of convolutions. So you have a convolutional layer and then another convolutional layer. That second convolutional layer would also be just with each of its units look at a certain section of the first convolutional layer. This is also often visualized with a representation that is something like this. You have a feature detector, which we call this, which is this node here. It's a feature detector, and it looks at a certain area in the image. And then you have another feature detector, which looks at another part of the image or has other weights, depending on how you interpret it. It could be that you have a feature detector here that looks at this subsection of the image. This feature detector would also look at this subsection but use other weights, so you could sort of try to learn a different feature. There are all sorts of variations thereof in the literature, but important is the sparse interactions. That's what we have visualized here, and we also see this here, that a feature detector doesn't look at the whole image, rather just at a certain region, which leads to far less parameters. And that's why these kernels are usually, or feature detectors, or we call them kernels, whatever, convolutions, they are essentially just much smaller than the input image. Makes it much more trainable, and we can train much faster and ideally have less overfitting. But still, if we have multiple of these layers, so H1 would be the first hidden layer, and we see that, for example, H3 looks at inputs X2, X3, X4. If we add another convolutional layer on top, so H1 would be the first convolutional layer, then H would be the first convolutional layer with convolutions H1 through H5. And G is the next convolutional layer with convolutions G1 through G5. And then with G5, you have a much wider receptive field because G3 looks at H2 through H4, and H2 looks at X1 through X3. H3 looks at X2, X3, X4. And H4 looks at X3, X4, X5. So if you just stack these convolutional layers, you would eventually widen your receptive field. However, you would need far less parameters than if you just stack these convolutions directly on top of each other without the sparse interactions. So like this, you can indirectly connect later convolutions to all the inputs. Then spatial arrangement is something that is important. In spatial arrangement, there are various hyperparameters. So we have this kernel here, and we have learned when we looked at kernels that kernels look at a part of an image, and then we move that kernel throughout the image. But what happens around the edges or corners of the image? Because we would only put, for example, a kernel here, but we maybe don't fully look at the edge, but rather we just create an output image that would get smaller and smaller because we are unable to fully look at that corner or that edge. So what you can do with padding is you can imagine you're just putting essentially all zeros around the image, and then you move that kernel at that new image, that input image, which has just been wider because you have put zeros all around it. And like this, you make sure that the output image has the same size as before, because you're just you're padding zeros around it, and you're not just increasing, or you're not just continuing making the output image smaller and smaller when you add more layers of kernels. And with this padding around, you also make sure that these corner or edge pixels get enough importance in the neural network. There are more parameters around spatial arrangement. For example, a stride is something else. A stride would mean how much you're moving this kernel. Before, when we looked at kernels, we always said we moved that kernel 1 pixel by pixel, but maybe this is something, depending on your use case, you don't need to do, or based on the data, because if you just move that kernel very, very slowly, then you're just creating your output image, but maybe it's too big, and maybe you want to compress it a little bit. Maybe there are a lot of redundant properties in the input image, and with a stride, you would determine how much you're moving that kernel in terms of the pixels in X and Y dimensions. And here the strides would be 3 and 2, because you would move this by 3 pixels in the height, so in the y-axis, and in the width by 2 pixels. This can all this can be configured in a library when you build your convolutional neural network. You're probably wondering which values you should pick for padding and striding. We'll later look at that with some best practices. If you don't have best practices, probably it's a lot of trial and error, because you need to find the hyperparameters that work the best for your data, and this can be computationally quite expensive. But there are all sorts of foundation models that are pre-trained and that have proven to work well for certain tasks, and those are the ones you can be using. But we'll see those foundation models that are pre-trained later. There's quite a lot of text in here. Feel free to read it, but I just provided you the essence of this. But the text here for spatial arrangement is a little bit more, in case you want to get a few more details. This chapter, or this part of this chapter, is actually also inspired a lot by this deep learning book from Goodfellow and his co-authors a few years ago. I've also put in the references where I got these figures from, that you see what a stride and padding is. I think it's important to visualize this, but you find more examples if you follow these URLs where this comes from. Then one other important concept of convolutional neural networks is parameter sharing. Parameter sharing means this is what we have seen so far with our sparse the sparse interactions we saw. The regular parameter sharing would be that we have our input pixels and we learn our feature detectors. But something that is important, the same feature appears in the image maybe multiple times, because certain edges not just appear in a certain part of the image, but in many parts of the image. And maybe I don't want to learn too many different edge detectors early on, because maybe some more general ones can be used throughout the whole image. And that's the idea of parameter sharing. Parameter sharing means I'm training the same kind of feature detector or the same kind of convolution in various parts of the image, and I'm reusing it throughout the image. So I don't have to train this always from scratch. Rather, I'm using a convolution or the same convolution in different parts of the convolutional layer, and I sort of have a more generalized feature detector that I can use. So again, when I do parameter sharing, this reduces the number of features I'm learning, and it reduces the complexity in the neural network, and probably also leads to better generalization. A lot of text in here, but feel free to read the text also for your revision. And we'll now put all of this together to see how convolutional neural networks work. I found this fantastic figure here a longer time ago in Wikipedia, which summarizes quite well what we want to do. We have an input image, and we then have a convolutional layer. And in the convolutional layer, we take advantage of all these things we have just seen, like parameter sharing, sparse interactions. So I have a feature detector or a convolution that detects something in here. Then I have more in here that detect other things. And this same feature map I have here, I can use in various parts throughout the image in order to find low-level features. That's what we meant by our parameter sharing. I have this convolutional layer, but as I see, there's still a lot of complexity in the convolutional layer, because I have a lot of different convolutions in there. And with a subsampling layer, I'm again building features that are from a certain window in the convolutional layer, but now they are doing something different. They are not building new convolutions, rather they are subsampling by taking advantage of certain summary statistics. So they look at a certain part of my feature map in a convolutional layer, and they try to calculate summaries. For example, what's the maximum value in there? What's the minimum value? Weighted averages, and so forth. So this subsampling layer is also called a pooling layer, where I'm just reducing the complexity in these feature maps. It's again new features that are high-level features or higher-level features. And what I can do again is I can put another convolutional layer behind the subsampling layer, and I can put another subsampling layer behind the convolutional layer. So I'm building increasingly more complex features. In some architectures, these subsampling layers are sometimes skipped. Sometimes something that is done directly is you have a convolutional layer, you have another convolutional layer, and you leave out the subsampling. But again, how to build the sort of right architecture is something we'll be seeing later. And once you have built all these blue parts here, there could be more than just 4 of these layers. It could be dozens of layers. You build or you learn increasingly more complex features. And eventually you still need to learn your actual task. For example, classification, regression, whatever. And for this, you would then, at the end of the last subsampling or at the end of the last convolutional layer, you would be putting a regular neural network. Probably just 2 or 3 hidden layers in order to learn your task. And then you have your outputs. You don't need a lot in this fully connected one. What is typically done is 2 or 3 layers. Already 1 layer could actually be enough, but let's say 2 to 3 fully connected layers. And then you have your output layer and you're done. So most of this convolutional neural network is not learning your actual task. Rather, it's learning features from your images. So you don't need to pick a feature detector yourself. Rather, you're learning features. And once you have learned high-level features, you can use those in order to classify or regress or do whatever, and you're done. So most of the neural network is not about the actual task. It's more high-level stuff. And this leads to lots of advantages that once you have trained feature detectors very well, you can be reusing them for other tasks and not just for your one specific task. So you could sort of try to copy the feature detector for some other vision problem and maybe just train an individual task-specific, fully connected part, but the feature detectors are super generic and can be reused. And others have done this for you, so you can reuse pre-trained neural networks that we will see soon. But we need to go back a little bit to the fact of how we can actually compute the partial derivatives for any neural network and any loss function. We have seen before the backpropagation algorithm, and I said this is something that would be discussed a little bit further in a big data, in a deep learning class, but we will now also look a little bit more into this. Concretely, we will generalize this a little bit now because we will put in, or we have a function that our neural network represents. We put in our input data and we want to get our labels out. And we put in data of dimension n. So the vector is of size n. You can also change this to a convolutional neural network where you put in a 2D structure. And eventually we have m many output units in this notation, because we've seen all these neural networks before. They don't just have one output unit. You could have this maybe in some case where you're doing one regression or something, but typically you would have multiple output units, for example, for classifying an input into the right class. So we are mapping with our function an n-dimensional input to an m-dimensional input. So the number of inputs to a certain number of labels that we are predicting. And what we want to do is we want to find the right parameters in our model, because so far we've always assumed that the parameters are there. We've looked a little bit into gradient descent, but in gradient descent, we also needed those partial derivatives. And that backpropagation can do it for you, but it's not that simple, and we'll be studying this now. Actually, what we need is a helper matrix, the Jacobian matrix, and the Jacobian matrix is a matrix that looks like this. It contains, for all our output functions, so the output function, or each output function would be one of those output nodes. So F1 would be the first output node, Fm would be the next output node, and we have all these parameters in, the inputs, x, and we want to compute this Jacobian matrix, which is essentially just a matrix that contains all the partial derivatives of all the functions by or along all the inputs x1 through xn. This is a helper function that you would often use in backpropagation or some other approach where you try to optimize the parameters. And now let's see how we can actually determine the partial derivatives. There are different approaches. When you have your specific neural network, so you have one specific architecture, you have a certain number of layers, a certain number of elements per layer, you have certain connections, whatever. What you could do is, in order to determine the partial derivatives, you would derive an analytical solution on a piece of paper and implement it. So you would essentially do backpropagation by hand, and you would sort of wonder, how does each parameter depend, or the partial derivative of a parameter depend on other parameters or the input. You can derive such an analytical solution, and this is something that was actually done for many years like this in the field of neural networks. The benefits are clear. Once you have by hand determined how to calculate each of the partial derivatives, you can execute this very fast because you can just hard code this in your code and you get very accurate results. There are some downsides to this. It is very challenging to do this. Say you have a huge neural network with a lot of parameters, a lot of layers. It could be very time consuming and error prone to determine manually what those partial derivatives look like. And once you have made a tiny change to your neural network's architecture, you just change the number of layers, you change the number of elements per layer, or you somehow change the connectivity in there, all of this needs to be redone. But this is what development of neural networks looked like for many, many years. And that's why it was also sort of a niche field, and it was quite difficult to train neural networks efficiently. So this is maybe not the approach we would be taking, but if you look at research papers from the 80s and 90s or early 2000s, maybe even, this is what a lot of work was addressed on how to determine all these partial derivatives manually. When I studied machine learning in my master's, so I did a master's in machine learning at Imperial College, in one of the machine learning courses, we actually tried this manually. Just on a piece of paper, we were given a simple neural network, and we had to determine what the partial derivatives look like. I can tell you this was no fun. We were also examined on this in the written exam, and was quite time consuming and error prone. But this is what training neural networks or new neural networks looked like in the past. Now we could think about better approaches. For example, symbolic differentiation. Symbolic differentiation would mean you would describe in a computer algebra system, for example, like Maple, you would be, or Mathematica, you would be describing what that connectivity looks like in your neural network. And you would then try to use this symbolic differentiation in order to give you the partial derivatives. Not concrete values, but symbols. So in symbolic differentiation, you would be working with symbols, and maybe you have ever used a computer algebra system like Maple to do something like this for you, or Mathematica, whatever. You don't do much manual work and you get very, very accurate results. So you're just automating what you did before by hand. But such symbolic differentiation systems, they are relatively inefficient. And this doesn't really scale to very sophisticated functions which represent modern neural networks. So while this sounds good in theory, it doesn't work in practice. We could try to approximate those partial derivatives we're interested in. And you can approximate every partial derivative or every derivative with something like this. This is the definition actually of a derivative. You say, I have my function for some input xj, and I add some difference on top, or I add something on top, and I take the difference to the previous value and I divide by h, and I make h very small, and what I want to get out is actually the derivative. So this is the very definition of a derivative, actually. And if you just assume h is very, very small, you can say, well, that this limit here is approximately just this term, because I assume that h is just very, very small, and it's an approximation. This is something you can do for every function in order to numerically differentiate it, and we could also use it here for our partial derivatives. But while this is very simple to calculate, it gives you quite inaccurate results because you don't know what's a numerically reasonable choice of h, how small, how big should it be. Potentially, this can actually be super slow if you try to run this on your computer, because you remember you have a lot of parameters and you have a lot of output functions. So maybe doing this doesn't really scale. It's quite slow. And the choice of h is challenging, and it probably gives you just very bad results, and it's not numerically stable. So maybe not the right thing to do. And one approach that is nowadays quite common in neural networks is something we call automatic differentiation. Automatic differentiation is a set of techniques that allows us to numerically evaluate the derivative of a function specified by a computer program. Automatic differentiation is not symbolic differentiation. That's very important. But rather what it gives us is a numerical evaluation of the derivative for a specific input. But it's something that works quite different to a numerical differentiation like this, because the automatic differentiation gives us much better results. How it works exactly, I think, is this still discussed in the AI programming lecture. In the past, Professor Ionescu taught this. Maybe give me thumbs up or thumbs down if this is still discussed in the AI programming class. If not, it's certainly something that is now discussed in the deep learning class. And the advantage of automatic differentiation is, with that approach, you can get a very good estimate of your derivatives evaluated for any structure of your neural network. So if you make some change to your neural network, you still get this automated. And this is something that was not available, say, 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, if you wanted the partial derivatives, you really had to do something like this by hand. And this severely limited R&D in neural networks, because you just made a tiny change to your structure and you completely had to redo that work from scratch. But now automatic differentiation is implemented in modern neural network libraries. So you don't need to worry about finding the partial derivatives anymore, because it gets done for you and then it gets put into gradient descent. There are lots of deep learning frameworks available. TensorFlow Keras is a combination that has been quite common in the last few years. PyTorch is also very popular. When I started working on deep learning more than 10 years ago, there was no TensorFlow yet. There was a library called Lasagne that I used a lot. Lasagne was called like this because the idea is in a lasagna that you eat, you have multiple layers that you stack on top. And that was the inspiration of the name Lasagne. This deep learning framework is not really common anymore. I think with TensorFlow, Keras, or PyTorch, there's now a much bigger community and much more people working on this. If you have used any other deep learning libraries, let us know in the chat. I'm curious to see, or whatever library you have used, maybe you can send us in the chat. And I'm curious to see if you have used Keras, TensorFlow, PyTorch, whatever. So just let us know. And for example, using Keras is extremely simple nowadays. All you're saying is, well, I'm building a model. It's a sequential model, so just a regular neural network, or a neural network where I connect one layer to the next layer. Then I'm adding a 2D convolutional layer. I can determine how many masks I want, certain parameters like strides and padding. I can define the activation function like ReLU. And after this convolutional layer, I'm putting a max pooling layer. So the maximum summary statistics behind there, and the pooling layer always looks at a 2x2 window. Here it's a 3x3 window. I guess that's what this 3 means. And I want 32 of them. But you can configure much more like stride and padding and so forth if you wish. After the max pooling, I put another convolutional 2D mask, then another max pooling, another convolutional 2D, and so forth. And you can configure here the activation layer and so forth. So it's all done for you, and you don't need to worry about how this is represented internally. When I started with TensorFlow, so TensorFlow, I think, was released 8 or 9 years ago. It wasn't that easy yet. You actually had to do a lot of work under the hood in order to build something like this. So it was far more code. But nowadays with Keras, this has become extremely simple, and it's internally mapped to more low-level code from TensorFlow, for example. Now, I got a question before from you. How do you figure out what's the number of layers required for a task? We could continue this. What's the number of units per layer? What's the right regularization factor? What's the right learning rate? All of this here is something we call model selection. And we want to optimize these so-called hyperparameters. I introduced this term earlier today. Hyperparameters means it's a global kind of parameter of the model. And how do you find those? With the number of layers, we could say, well, maybe the more layers, the better, because we can learn more features in our hierarchy. But if I add more layers, training takes longer, and I tend to overfit. So maybe that's not what I want. So I need to make some compromise. And for model selection, you can try a lot of different stuff. You could try just trial and error and say, I'll try this with 10 hidden layers, and I want 500 units per hidden layer. And I want a learning rate of 0.1. If it doesn't work very well, maybe I use a smaller learning rate. We've seen before, when I visualized the gradient descent, if I have a learning rate that is too big, it may overshoot. It doesn't converge. If my learning rate is too slow, it also doesn't converge because it's not reaching the minimum. And one of the questions I have retained from before was, how do I get out of a local minimum? If I get stuck in a local minimum, that's maybe not what I want. One approach could be I just try the training from scratch, And when I initialize the neural network for training, I want to use random parameters initially. That's what we saw in the backpropagation part today. So by using different random values in the parameters, maybe I end up in a different minimum. I could try to use a slightly larger learning rate, because a bigger learning rate may lead to overshooting, that I miss or that I don't converge. But maybe for an irrelevant, very high local minimum, it helps me to get out. So maybe a slightly bigger learning rate can help. Just optimizing your learning rate could be a whole lecture today, because there are all sorts of variations of how to optimize your learning rate. Maybe there are some approaches you start with a larger learning rate, and as you keep training, the learning rate gets smaller and smaller. So ideally you converge, but if it gets too small too quickly, maybe I get stuck in a local minimum. I understand there's always this worry to get stuck in a local minimum. It often looks really like you get stuck in a local minimum before, when I had visualized gradient descent. But remember, in the real world, you're not just dealing with a single dimension, but rather you're dealing with millions or billions of dimensions. And getting stuck in a local minimum in millions or billions of dimensions is far more difficult than just getting stuck in a single dimension. So this worry about getting stuck in a local minimum, I know it exists, and it always looks traumatic on a plot where we just have one parameter. But in a real neural network with millions or billions of parameters, getting stuck in a local minimum, at least in a very bad one, is far less likely, because you would need to get stuck in every dimension, something that I can hardly visualize for you. But I wouldn't be too worried about the local minima when training a neural network. It can be a problem, but I think it's far less, obviously you will converge in some local minimum and unlikely in the global one. But just getting stuck in a really bad local minimum, something unlikely, because also with your learning rate, you can still get out of a very bad local minimum early on. But how do I determine all these hyperparameters? Trial and error is one thing, or experience, because you have just done this very, very often. One approach is grid search. Grid search would mean I determine multiple values for my hyperparameters. And I'll show you now how this could work. So, hyperparameters. We assume now we have two hyperparameters to keep it simple. Say we want to have a learning rate and say, the number of layers. And for the learning rate, I could have values which are 0.01, 0.03, 0.01, and 0.3. So 5 many. Well, let's say, no, 4, sorry. 4 possible values. We could add much more, obviously. Like, and for the number of layers, I say I want 5 hidden layers, 10, 15, or 20. So I also have 4. And in total, I have 4 times 4, 16 combinations to try out. And this approach is something I call grid search. With grid search, I would need to try all these combinations, meaning this learning rate with this number of layers, with another number of layers, and so forth. And then for the next learning rate, and so forth. But I just have 4 values now in these 2 parameters, and I already have 16 combinations, and I have much more parameters or hyperparameters, the number of units per layer, the regularization factor, and much more. And I can easily run into a huge number of combinations when I add more hyperparameters. And then for each of these combinations in grid search, I would need to train a neural network, which can take very long. So this is something maybe that doesn't work too well. But I can do a different approach, which we call randomized grid search. And for both grid search and randomized grid search, this is implemented in libraries for you. It's available, for example, in scikit-learn. Scikit-learn is a very famous machine learning library. It doesn't address deep learning too much. It's more on everything else in machine learning, yet it offers a lot of features. And in there, you can also find grid search or randomized grid search. And you also find this, obviously, in other machine learning libraries. So you just pass your parameter values or hyperparameter values, and it does grid search for you. But a randomized grid search works different. I again have my parameters like the learning rate and the number of layers. And maybe I don't want to try these 16 combinations. And remember, if I have much more values and much more hyperparameters, it could be easily millions of combinations. Rather, for the learning rate, I could say it's something between 0 and 1. And for the number of layers, and I say, well, it's an interval. So the interval is a real value between 0 and 1, where 0 and 1 are included, for example, in this interval. And for the number of layers, I could say, well, it's between 1 and 100, and it's an integer value. And with randomized grid search, I say, well, I want to have 20 trials. Pick me something from these hyperparameter ranges. And then I don't need to try all possible combinations, which could be millions of combinations. Rather, I only try 20. And where do I know from that 0.01 is a concrete value that makes sense? Why not 0.02? And because I define these intervals, I'm randomly drawing from the intervals. Here I say this is a real value between 0 and 1, or float value. And this is an int value from 1 to 100. And then maybe the first trial could be something like 0.005 would be the learning rate, and 16 layers. The next trial would be 0.26 and 4 layers. So it would just randomly pick 20 combinations from these intervals. And I don't need to try out millions of combinations, maybe just 20 or 100. And I don't need to define discrete values. Rather, I'm just defining intervals and the type of the interval, and I will randomly draw from that. So maybe just confirm with a thumbs up or thumbs down if you got the difference between grid search and a randomized grid search. And waiting for your reactions. Good, there are positive reactions. So a grid search, I would really need to try all these discrete combinations, but I don't know if this discretization made much sense. With a randomized grid search, I'm rather defining the intervals, and I'm randomly drawing, and I'm just drawing a couple of dozens of trials and not millions of possible combinations. This is an approach that has become quite common over the years. A totally different approach is automated machine learning, which we also call AutoML. And automated machine learning aims to automate the process of applying machine learning to real-world problems. The hope would be we could automate all machine learning, including data collection, aggregation, cleansing, evaluation, and so forth. But that's quite far away, and that's, I think, at least from today's understanding, largely science fiction. Current AutoML frameworks, they address certain problems in the machine learning pipeline. For example, hyperparameter optimization, or the choice of machine learning model. Because I don't know maybe which type of neural network or which architecture I should pick, plus which learning rate and some other hyperparameters. And auto machine learning frameworks are available at our hand. For example, AutoSK-learn. We all use scikit-learn, and there's AutoSK-learn, which aims to automate certain work with scikit-learn. I want to do some classification problem, not related to neural networks here, just in general machine learning. And I want to automate a learning task for classifying. And I don't know, do I need to pick a support vector machine, a decision tree, a logistic regression, a Bayesian model? I don't care. I just tell the system, pick me the right classifier. Plus, pick me the right hyperparameters. Maybe do some pre-processing of the data, like feature scaling, feature normalization. Give a few tries, and once you're done, finish. And then this AutoSK-learn classifier, I can specify when it should stop, maybe when a certain error threshold has been reached, or maybe I should do 20 trials or 100 trials. And internally, it will try to find a model and adequate hyperparameters. Has any of you ever used something like this, automated machine learning? If you have, maybe thumbs up or thumbs down. Also, if you have not done this, I would always be happy also about a negative reaction. Some have not. If you have not done this, definitely give a try at this, because once you work as a data scientist, you will not be paid by your employer for long whether you're able to determine if a decision tree or logistic regression works better on your problem. Honestly, no one cares whether you use a decision tree or logistic regression, unless maybe there's some very specific requirements. But for most projects, you just want to predict, and you want to predict as well as possible and reduce the development costs as much as possible. So use automated machine learning to do that. Maybe it doesn't work as great as if an AI expert does that, but it can already give you a very good start very quickly. And then maybe you're okay with the result, maybe not. And then maybe you can still fine-tune it as an expert, but don't start from scratch. Make sure those tools help you. And the good thing is, libraries like AutoSK-learn, they don't do naive trial and error. They don't just randomly try stuff that doesn't make sense. Rather, they start with some model and some hyperparameters that are maybe relatively naively picked. But based on that, they try to pick the next model selection in a smart way. So internally, libraries like AutoSK-learn, they actually use machine learning to internally optimize the AutoML process. Often they use some form of Bayesian optimization. So it's not just 20 random picks, but rather it will pick a few models and hyperparameter settings. And then based from there, it tries to use machine learning to pick better ones. So we are using internally machine learning in order to optimize our machine learning problem. And this has definitely changed the market, because you don't need to be an AI expert anymore to build simple AI models. And it's just an automation in the AI pipeline. It's certainly something you have to be using, because you won't be paid by your boss just for trying for weeks whether to use a decision tree or a Gaussian process. Rather, let the tool help you, and you can focus on other tasks, maybe data cleansing, talking to customers, assessing your model, making your model safer, or those kind of things. But you will not be paid just for randomly trying machine learning models. And as there is an auto-sklearn, there's also an auto-keras. Auto-keras is an optimization or an AutoML approach for keras. There's also some for PyTorch and others, by the way. And what I can say is, well, I want an image classifier. I have my training data, and then I want to predict. And I don't care what that image classifier looks like. Just find me one that works well on my data. So most of what we have discussed today in this course, you can automate by 4 lines of code. You still need to know about neural networks and the theory, because this one obviously will not always give you the best classifier, but it may give you a hint. And the hint that you get, you can assess whether that model makes sense or not, whether you can fine-tune it, plus use all your expert knowledge, but take advantage of such tools because you will be more productive than others. Then obviously, we need to train efficiently, and we all want to use high-end hardware to train deep neural networks efficiently, because training deep neural networks takes a lot of time. Nowadays, we can use hardware like GPUs. GPUs were originally built for rendering graphics, because rendering graphics can be described well in terms of matrix operations, in particular matrix multiplications, matrix additions. And that is something you can parallelize very well, because all you need to do is very simple operations at scale, just multiplying and adding. This was understood for decades, and that's why there are graphics processors. And then 15 years ago or something, it was understood that you can also try to use such graphics processors to train neural networks. Because if you're able to express all the operations in your neural network, both in your training as well as in your predicting, in terms of linear algebra operations, in particular matrix additions, matrix multiplications, then you can try to execute this on a GPU highly efficiently. So when you write your own code for neural networks, maybe you want to implement your own neural network, don't use a lot of loops, rather think in terms of matrix operations, or use vectorizations or matrix multiplications, matrix additions, and so forth. And if you can express your operations in a set of something like this, you can use libraries like TensorFlow or others in order to convert this to code that runs on a GPU. For example, CUDA, if you use the NVIDIA environment, if you use other environments, there's not just NVIDIA, obviously. There are also cross-compilers available for this. GPUs are helpful because GPUs have a high degree of parallelism. They have hundreds or thousands of cores based on the architecture, but writing code for a GPU is probably challenging because you don't know how to write code for that. But you can use a cross-compiler like that is offered in TensorFlow or others, and you have lots of simple operations that you can do at scale, like additions, multiplications, but you need to write that code well, or you need to generate it well so that it also gives you massive speedups. While GPUs are very famous for training neural networks, we still need CPUs. CPUs can execute very simple and complex instructions at the same time, and they're easy to program. And even if you write really bad code, nowadays modern CPUs can execute your code quite well because of out-of-order execution, branch prediction, and those kind of things. But CPUs have a limited degree of parallelism. But the difference between CPUs and GPUs is something I discuss in my big data course in detail. So I just want to provide a quick overview. But GPUs are really great for training neural networks. And this is something that was proposed in the original TensorFlow paper in 2015 for TensorFlow, but I used already in 2014, I used Lasagne, which already offered this. Modern deep learning libraries, they can use multiple GPUs at the same time. So you can use hundreds or thousands of GPUs. You need to buy them, so that's an investment, but you can also rent some or use them through a cloud if you don't want to buy your own GPUs. And obviously, you or your employer will probably not buy thousands of GPUs, but some, or you use the cloud in order to use them at your convenience, and you'll be able to scale. There are other specialized hardware like FPGAs or tensor processing units, but that's again something I discuss in my big data course. So it's just a little bit of an outlook. Now we will wonder which kind of neural network we need to pick, because a question we face today multiple times is how many layers, which architecture, and so forth. And there are some challenges. Finding the right architecture is tricky, and training a neural network, at least a large one from scratch, is also tricky because we need a lot of data and we need a lot of computational power. But what we can do is maybe not start from scratch, but use best practices from others. You all know the term graduate student. It's a term used in the US for a PhD student, someone who's working towards his or her doctoral degree. And as we've talked today about hyperparameter optimization, there's this joke term from a few years ago, which is something like graduate student optimization. So some PhD students, or quite a lot, they spent their whole PhD just on finding some architecture that worked well for a specific problem. So, and then we're talking about graduate student optimization. You just try a lot of different architectures. And far more than, you know, an AutoML library can do for you, and maybe far more complex architectures. And some of these architectures that were found proved to be very helpful. And those were made available through research papers and open source. And what we get from there is pre-trained models that were trained on very large data sets. And you can download these models, so the code as well as the weight values, and you can use them for your task. Now, in recent years, there has been this term come up, foundation models. So it's a foundation, a pre-trained model that you can use. And maybe it works, or if it doesn't work yet, you can fine-tune it. Maybe there's a very good open source deep learning architecture for specific computer vision problems. And maybe it has a very, very good feature detector because it was trained on just millions or hundreds of millions of images. And maybe you can use this and you can just fine tune. Maybe you can just leave the feature detector as is and you just fine tune these last 2 or 3 layers in the neural network for classifying your task, for example. And you can just reuse the feature detector. So you're fine tuning. Maybe you also want to fine tune your feature detector a little bit because you have very specific images. You could be doing that, but maybe the feature detector already works quite well. So we use a pre-trained model, which was trained on huge amounts of data, and we just reuse it and train it a little bit on our very specific data. So we are doing fine tuning. Sometimes fine tuning is also called transfer learning. And I want to show you a few selected architectures that have become very important also in the history of deep learning in the last 10 to 15 years. And you will also see how quickly they have grown in the last few years. In 2012, a neural network called AlexNet was published. And AlexNet was trained on the ImageNet dataset. The ImageNet dataset is a dataset of 1,000 classes, and the version from 2010 was 1.2 million images. So classes could be a house, a car, a plane, and there were 1,200 images. And the AlexNet was trained on that data set. And the AlexNet has 650,000 neurons and 60 million weights. And it achieved a so-called top 5 test error of 15%. The top 5 error would mean that you predict the probability or the probability of each class of these 1,000 classes for an image. And if you take the top 5 classes that you're predicting in your neural network, and if one of those top 5 classes is the right class, you have matched correctly. So the 5 most likely classes you have predicted, if one of them is the right class, you would be correct. And that's the top 5, and the top 5 test error, so where the top 5 was wrong, was 15%. So 85% in the top 5 were correct. This was a major advancement in 2012, and the AlexNet was described in a paper, and the code and all of this was made available. It appeared in a very famous conference, and the architecture looks something like this. You feed in an image which is 224 by 224 pixels. Then you have your convolutions. Then here are various convolutions of a certain size. So the convolutions are 11 times 11, and you have 55 of that in here. Then you have a max pooling, and then another convolution, and so forth. And eventually we have 1,000 output units for the 1,000 classes, and we have our last 2 hidden layers, and each hidden layer has like 2,048 units. This architecture was found to be very helpful for this ImageNet data set, and you see the error was 15.3% on this 2010 data set. And then very quickly in the next few years, a lot of progress was made. ResNet is a new architecture that we will soon see, was published in 2016, has up to 152 layers, and suddenly only had an error in the top 5 test error of 3.5%. So a major progress just within a few years. And the ResNet uses a different architecture. So there are various variations of ResNet, also some with a lower number of layers. For example, here was one of 34 layers. And a regular 34-layer neural network would look something like this. You have a convolutional layer, a pooling layer, convolutions, a lot of convolutional layers behind each other, as you can see here. And the ResNet introduced so-called residual layers, where you also sometimes skip some of the layers. So we see these arcs here, where you feed into this convolutional layer the output of the previous convolutional layer, as well as the output from 2 layers before. And so this was merged here, and then both fed into that. And this residual architecture was found to be very helpful in that time. And it massively reduced the error in the ImageNet dataset. So you can find the ResNet and AlexNet and many more, and also very new architectures. They are all available for you on the internet. You can download them as open source and use them. And this is also something that may be helpful for some of you in your computer vision projects. Maybe you don't want to build all models from scratch. Maybe some of you want to do that, and you're welcome to do that. But some of you maybe want to use a convolution or a neural network and fine-tune it or customize it to your specific needs in terms of a larger application in your projects. You're also welcome to do this. One architecture that has become popular is called YOLO. YOLO stands for You Only Look Once. And YOLO is a convolutional neural network that allows us to do localization and classification of multiple objects in an image. So you pass this image, it finds you a dog with high probability, a bicycle, a truck, even though this bicycle is partially occluded by the dog. This was version 4 from a few years ago, and there is obviously newer versions of YOLO. Feel free to access this as open source, and every year some students use YOLO for their projects and fine-tune it to their specific data and their specific tasks. But don't always just start from scratch. Try to reuse work of others when possible. And all of this is available as open source, so you should be taking advantage. There are lots of more resources on convolutional neural networks on the internet. Deep learning, there's a deep learning institute by NVIDIA. So this is now not an advertisement for NVIDIA, but they offer some courses for free. Others, maybe you need to pay a little bit. I'm not recommending here you to pay, but maybe take a look at what NVIDIA offers, because they offer quite a lot through their Deep Learning Institute. There are also a lot of free courses, by the way, and other things. Obviously, they hope that you like NVIDIA and CUDA and you buy their GPUs eventually. But take a look at, for example, the NVIDIA Deep Learning Institute. And if you look at other hardware vendors, they offer similar stuff. And they offer quite a lot of good courses. I also did some of them in the past to get some more practice. And from time to time, I still look into this Deep Learning Institute as well as other providers. So this is not, very importantly, exclusively an advert for NVIDIA. Just take a look what's out there, because the field of AI is rapidly moving, and there are lots of resources for you at hand. Maybe some of this could also be helpful for your projects to get some new ideas, what others are doing, and maybe get some code that you can reuse or use as some inspiration. Now, we have finished the convolutional neural networks, which was quite a big block today, but we still have half an hour left to continue with image sequence processing. First of all, I want to know from you if there are any questions left for neural networks, convolutional neural networks. I tried to answer most of the questions I saw here. If there are any doubts or problems, let me know, and I'll be happy to come back to your questions. And I know it was probably a lot of new theory, lots of maths for you today. But I guess all of this will also become more clear to you once you do your projects and you run some code and you try to implement those kind of things, and you're able to take full advantage of this theory then. And when you use high-level libraries like AutoML, you still need to know what's happening under the hood, so you're able to assess the results and make sure you actually build something useful. And you know how to tweak it and fine-tune it and so forth. So just downloading a foundation model and using it is not enough for your projects, obviously, but I'll be saying more about the projects in a few weeks' time. What I also want to say is, up to here, we have actually, I think, established all the relevant foundations you would be seeing in an introductory course to computer vision. We've looked at pixels and filters as the very foundation. Then we looked at regions of images. We did segmentation. We worked on detecting features. Features are used for object recognition. And one completely different approach are convolutional neural networks, in which we can self-learn features. Convolutional neural networks are helpful, but they're not a silver bullet. Depending on your task, you may need one of these more traditional approaches or combine them with convolutional neural networks. So convolutional neural networks are not a silver bullet that will solve all your problems. That's why we've discussed in this course more than convolutional neural networks. I know we've probably discussed quite a lot of content in a couple of weeks, but when I established this course 4 years ago, I was also very ambitious, and I wanted to build a very challenging course. And I think it's important we're doing theory in the first half of the term, and in the second half of the term, you're doing projects in order to get more practice. And when I designed this course, I had a little bit of a look at what others are teaching in their courses. And I looked at some top universities like MIT, Stanford, Imperial College, and I looked at what they are discussing in their introductory computer vision courses as well as the advanced computer vision course. And I tried to, or I got inspired by them, and I tried to choose topics that are challenging, but also relevant to the real world and to real world problems. And I think you got a good essence of what MIT and Stanford do in their introductory as well as advanced computer vision courses in this course here. So it's quite compressed. I made it more accessible because I did a few revisions or primers like eigenvalues or Taylor. But I think overall this course is super competitive compared to also what Stanford and MIT do. And then I knew we can get up to convolutional neural networks here very quickly, actually, if we discuss it the right way. And so far, we can work on static images. We have an image, we can classify it. But actually, the world around us is also changing. We don't live in a static world. We see videos through our eyes, or we have a video stream. And that's why we'll be looking now at image sequence processing. And after we have just done this, we will also look at the foundation of mobile robotics, because we also want to interact with our world. So we should know about robots. And in the Outlook chapter, there are a few more advanced things like vision transformers, stereo vision, generative adversarial networks, but those are just a few things for the Outlook. And now we still have time to start with image sequence processing today. We'll be looking at motion, and we'll be seeing why image sequences or processing image sequences is important, for example, for tracking. And you can do image sequence processing again with neural networks, with recurrent neural networks, if you wish. But there's also the deep learning course taught by Professor Wahl. And he also wants to discuss recurrent neural networks. So I felt I shouldn't be discussing them here in this course again, because that's something he'll be doing in his course. And again, there are not just neural networks to process image sequences or sequences in general. There's much more in theory. And while recurrent neural networks are helpful for certain problems, they're not helpful for other problems. And that's why we'll be looking at a very popular signal processing tool, which is called a Kalman filter. It's a very helpful model for working with sequential data, and we will be discussing it largely in the next lecture. But in order to understand it, we need an introduction to temporal models. And after we have done the Kalman filter, we'll have a little bit more time to generalize the problems we have looked at. We will look at the correspondence problem, and then one other way how to process image sequences is the optical flow. So in computer vision, we also need to deal with motion, because we are not just dealing with static images, but rather with image sequences, because some scene is evolving. So we have a temporal aspect. And maybe we want to track features in a scene, because tracking features could help us, for example, to track objects. We use phones and we take photos despite us shaking the phone. Our phone includes some motion stabilization. That could be an application or one way we deal with motion in computer vision. Maybe some behavioral understanding, maybe collision detection in autonomous driving. For this, we need to process image sequences to understand scene dynamics and so forth. So there's actually lots of applications when we deal with motion. Object tracking is one of those. For example, you have here a scene from London, and there is a camera and you see other objects moving. For example, you see this bus moving. But our car in which we have this camera is also moving. And maybe we just want to track objects in there. And for this, we need to track features. This could be another example of surveillance, say in a police setting. You have cars and we want to track these cars, maybe in order to track people, maybe a criminal who's on the run, but could also be for understanding traffic flows in a city, which could be improved. This traffic setting here overall looks quite scary to me. It doesn't seem to be well organized, not really traffic lanes, people just driving into each other's direction. I don't feel very comfortable with this, I have to say. And this could be an application of tracking in an automated way. And we'll be now looking at so-called temporal models. And temporal models allow us to process temporal data. And we'll discuss this from a highly generic perspective. We can apply this to images, but we can apply this to much more temporal data, like audio data or some other sequential data, some stream data, whatever. And the beauty is it can all be applied to vision eventually as well. And I'll show you now 3 settings that, first of all, maybe look very different, but they have something in common. Imagine you're walking through a jungle or a forest, and you see a bird flying around there. But sometimes you don't see the bird because the bird is maybe hidden by some leaves or some branch of a tree. And then you see the bird again. And you as a human, you can estimate quite well where the bird is right now, even if you didn't see the bird for a few seconds, but you just saw the previous motion of the bird plus the environment. So you can estimate quite well where the bird could be. I noticed this here as well when I sit in my office, because I have a lot of trees in my garden and there are birds flying around. And I can also do this kind of state estimation here. Another example could be from radar operations, where you, like in old radars, say from World War II, you only got a state update every 10 seconds on the screen, but the operator had to estimate in the meantime where that object could be. Or when you go back to 1600 something, when Kepler tried to reconstruct the motion of planets just from a collection of extremely inaccurate observations that he could take of planets with his instruments. But yet he was able to reconstruct the motion of the planets. So all these 3 scenarios, our bird, our radar, or Kepler, they have something in common. What we want to do is we want to estimate state variables, in this case, a position and a velocity from very noisy observations over time. We make observations, but they are noisy because maybe this bird is occluded. Maybe Kepler couldn't measure the states or the distance of the planets very well, or in the radar, there's lots of noise. So lots of noisy observations over time, and we want to estimate those state variables, like position and velocity. And this state estimation is also called filtering in the context of temporal models. And our Kalman filter does filtering, so it does state estimation. But in order for us to understand the Kalman filter, we need to study a couple of foundations of temporal models. What we are essentially looking at is we're looking at my favorite AI book, AI, A Modern Approach, by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig. Who of you has this book, say, as a print version or a PDF and uses it sometimes to study? If you use this book, AI, A Modern Approach by Russell and Norvig, send me maybe a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I think it's the most famous AI book or textbook used. If you don't use it, maybe get it. I think it's probably the most helpful book for your whole studies. It's now available in the 4th edition for a couple of years. So just to mention him briefly, Peter Norvig, he's the research director at Google, and Stuart Russell is a professor at Berkeley. And they are both super famous, and they have been publishing this book for the last probably 30 years now in the 4th edition, AI, A Modern Approach. I actually got to meet Stuart Russell 3 months ago when I was at the annual meeting of the World Economy Forum in Davos, and I had a chat for an hour with him, which was quite inspiring. And this book covers AI in detail and is super helpful. And there is a chapter in it which is called probabilistic reasoning over time. And the Kalman filter is one of many tools presented in this book. And if you look into this book, there are maybe 6 pages on the Kalman filter. And when I wondered how could I teach the Kalman filter, a few years ago, I went back to this book and wondered how does this book present the Kalman filter, because that book is overall super helpful. And I saw, well, there are 6 pages for a Kalman filter. But in order for us to understand the Kalman filter, we need a lot of foundations in temporal models. So I'm trying to present the essence of the temporal models today and next time as well. And once we have understood the temporal models, we can advance by looking into the Kalman filter. So concretely, in the world where we are, we have a series of snapshots, of time slices, which we call them. So we look at discrete time steps, so time slices. We're not looking at continuous time, we're looking at discrete time slots. And for each time slot, we deal with various random variables. Some variables are observable while others are not. And it's very important, discrete time steps. If you want to deal with continuous time steps or continuous time, you need to be looking at stochastic differential equations, but we're not doing this in this course. We're purely looking at discrete time points, so snapshots. And we will make a couple of assumptions. We will claim that or say that the same subset of variables is observable in each time slice, just for simplification. And we have this X in uppercase and bold with subscript T. This denotes the set of state variables at time T, which are assumed to be unobservable. So these are the states we actually want to estimate. And E are the set of observable evidence variables. So XT is unobservable. That's what we want to estimate. And E is the evidence we can observe. And the observation, a concrete observation at time T is some set of values ET. And we can, now this is super abstract, we'll be looking at an example that is also used throughout the book in this chapter. Imagine you're a security guard and you're stationed at an underground facility that is secret. And you never get to leave your underground facility, and you're wondering whether it's raining or not. You don't have access. You only see the director coming in the morning, and the director carries an umbrella or not. So what you don't know is this XT, this is unobservable. If it's actually raining or not, this is unobservable. And we can say rain at day T, so T is a day, or RT in short, whether it's raining or not. And what you get to observe is whether the director carries an umbrella or not. So umbrella at time T or UT is whether the director brings in an umbrella or not. That's what you can observe, but you cannot observe the real world. And in this chapter, we'll be working a lot with this example in order to model or to estimate whether it's raining or not. So we are doing filtering or state estimation. We want to estimate xt based on observations and past knowledge. And we will assume that our state sequence starts at t0. And this is just a convention which will simplify our modeling. And we assume that at the next day at t=1, evidence comes in. So we are starting with t=0 in our state sequence, and evidence will come in as of t=1. And we will also have a notation that we call xa:b, which donates the set of variables from xa to xb, where xa and xb are included. So not like in Python where the b in a slice would be excluded, but here a and b are inclusive. As an example, u13 represents the variables u1, u2, u3, where u refers to our umbrella, whether the director brought in an umbrella or not. And what we need now is various models, and we will introduce a transition model. And this transition model describes the next step of how the world evolves. We will also later have a sensor model that takes this evidence into account, but we can write out our transition model as something like this. P, and it's in bold, so we're dealing with a probability distribution. And we want to know what's the probability distribution of our state variables at time t, given all the past state values we have from time 0 up to the last time before, which is t-1. This is the transition model, so we want to make some inference about how does the state evolve based on the past states. Later, we will also include the sensor model where we take the evidence. And now we run into a problem. Imagine t grows, and we have said that xt depends on all the past x's from 0 to t-1. But now t is growing, this keeps running over time, so it's unbounded. And then making a decision about xt, given all the past states, is complex when t gets bigger and bigger, because I need to look into more and more past states before. So what we are actually doing now is we're making a so-called Markov assumption, which goes back to the Russian statistician Andrei Markov. And he introduced a concept called a Markov process, sometimes also called a Markov chain, where we simplify this. So we make the assumption that xt does not depend on x0 up to xt-1 anymore, but only on xt only depends on xt-1. So only just on the past states or the past state variables, not on all the ones before. And this is a so-called first-order Markov process because xt only depends on the previous xt, not on the ones from even before. You can also say we have a second-order Markov process where xt depends on xt-1 as well as xt-2. We can also try to visualize these Markov processes. We have our xt, and it depends on xt-1. xt-1 depends on xt-2. If we have a second-order Markov process, we say xt depends on both xt-1 and xt-2. You could also have a third-order Markov assumption, whatever. But this is now an example of a first or second-order Markov process. We will be dealing with so-called stationary processes. A stationary process, in short, means that the laws by which the process is governed will not change. Obviously, these distributions will change, but not the laws of how these distributions are generated. So a stationary process means the rules stay over time, the rules don't change, but it's obviously a dynamic process, not static, because static would mean that the states don't change at all. But the states will change, but the rules of how to update the states will stay. We will now also look, after our transition model, into the so-called sensor model. And in a sensor model, we will take into account our evidence. And what I want to have is a probability distribution where I say, well, the evidence at time t depends on all the states as well as all the past evidence. But this, again, is extremely complex to calculate. If I want to know what's the probability distribution of my current evidence, given all the past states and all the past evidence. So I will also simplify this and make a Markov assumption, and I say the probability distribution of my evidence at time t only depends on my current state. And this is our sensor model, which we also call sometimes the observation model. And we can try to put this example here. We can say, for example, we can represent this as a Bayesian network. And what I have here are various probabilities. And I think I will draw this on the iPad in the last few minutes, because then it will also be more clear what these numbers mean. So we will have an example of our transition and state model. Sorry, transition and sensor model. So key is here. If we have rain at time t, if you look at the original slides or the figure from the book, they write out rain, but I just write R instead of rain. And no, I wrote it out by accident, sorry. So rain at t minus 1. And we will now look at the evidence. And the evidence is the umbrella at t minus 1, umbrella at time t, and umbrella at t minus 1. And we have these probability variables, or this table, which I do in blue. Based on whether it rained the day before, I want to know if it rains now. So rain today at time t, given the rain at the day before. If it rained the day before, so if RT minus 1 is true, then there is a 70% chance it rains today. And if it didn't rain the day before, there's a 0.3 chance it rains today. So the way you need to read this, if it rained yesterday, there is a 0.7 chance it rains today. And if it didn't rain yesterday, there is a 0.3% chance it's raining today. These two, they don't need to add up to 1. That's very important. This is only by chance here, because what needs to add up is if it rains today, based on if it rained yesterday and if it didn't rain yesterday. Sorry, no, I'll write this out, then it's probably more clear because I just said it wrong. What is important? What needs to add up is if it rains today, given it rained yesterday, plus the probability there is no rain, or maybe write no rain like this. These two need to add up to 1. So the probability it rains today, it didn't rain yesterday, and the probability it doesn't rain today, given it rained yesterday, this needs to add up to 1. So we have this 0.7 that it rains today and 0.3 that it doesn't rain today. But this is not the 0.3 from down there. If I wrote a 0.1 down there, this would still be fine. So these two rows, they don't need to add up to 1. This is just pure chance. What needs to add up is if it rains today or if it doesn't rain today, based on the rain the day before. So this is super important that these two add up, and this F has something to do with the condition and not with today's rain. So don't mix up this table. And we have another table about the rain and the evidence. Rain today, true. I'll use the same color scheme. Probability of an umbrella today, given today's rain, is like this. So what this means is, the first one is the probability that there is an umbrella today, given there is rain today, is 0.9. So the probability there is no umbrella today when there's rain today is 0.1. And the second row means something else. It means what's the probability of an umbrella today when there is no rain today? That's 0.2. And the probability of not having an umbrella when there is no rain today is 0.8. This is how you need to read these two. The first one up here is the transition model. And this here is the sensor model. It's written out in the slides in a much nicer way than if I write this. And tomorrow, sorry, not tomorrow, in the next lecture, we will be discussing this example in greater way. We'll be looking at the complete joint distribution, and we'll be looking at various inference tasks, including filtering. And when we have discussed filtering and the other tasks, we will concretely look at this, how the Kalman filter does it, because we look at this purely from generic temporal models, and the Kalman filter makes certain assumptions, and we'll be in detail discussing this then. If you remember any probability theory from your statistics course in your past semester, that's very helpful because we need the Bayes theorem, conditional probabilities, and so forth. I'll be revising this as needed in the next lecture. And as I said, we will not have a lecture next week because next week you can pick the robot. So we meet in 2 weeks again, and you have enough time for revision of convolutional neural networks, as well as what we have done today with the introduction to temporal models. and maybe you have some time to look at your robots. If there are no questions anymore, we're done for today, and I see you in 2 weeks at the lecture, and please pick a robot next week if you want to do a robot vision project. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.